Our next speaker, who gets her full 35 minutes, is Laura Truax.
Well, that really adds a level of pressure, doesn't it? I need to do the whole take off my watch thing and make sure I'm careful with my time. Hey, I'm here to talk about something that I think is one thing that's been a galvanizing force in our church at LaSalle Street Church in Chicago. It's the power of conversation. The power of conversation. And I'm talking about conversation in a lot of different ways. I'm talking about conversations that make you vulnerable, conversations that make you sweat a little bit, conversations where your heart starts to race and you want to stand up and walk away, conversations about things that really matter. And I want to talk about them in a way that I think it's possible, and I want to hold out this hope in front of us because I've experienced it myself, that you can disagree. You can disagree strongly and not disengage. That it's possible in your own life. You've seen it potentially if you're married. Hopefully you're still engaged, you know. But it's possible in a group setting too. It's possible in a church. It feels like at this, kind of as we've been talking about in each one of these sessions, it feels like we are standing at an age of great promise. And yet we're more fractured and we're more polarized than ever before. And the church, by and large, is not offering a way forward. We're not showcasing a model of conversation. In fact, sometimes we're the center points of those who are pointing the other finger and who are disengaging. So I want to begin with a very quick, it's actually an exactly 8-minute presentation on what our church, LaSalle Street Church in downtown Chicago, what we experienced when we started to have a hard conversation. It's carefully scripted. There's 20 slides and there's 20 seconds per slide. So I'll be going quickly. It's designed to kind of keep us awake and engaged at the 3 o'clock hour here. What happens when you talk about what no one wants to talk about? What happens when an evangelical, justice-seeking, social activist church, a church that skews liberally, politically, and fiscally, and socially, it's non-denominational, it's urban, it's maybe a church a lot like yours. What happens when that church begins to engage in a conversation? LaSalle Street Church was a church that created the first Christian criminal defense legal aid clinic in the country. We were privileged to build a 26-floor apartment building for modest-income seniors, and with private and public funds, we built a housing complex with intentional targets of mixed income and race. We were evangelical. Not everyone thought alike in our church or would even consider themselves evangelical. We had robust conversations, though, on gun control and on abortion and on military funding and intelligent design. We talked about evolution, and we talked about the Bible. How often we talked about the Bible. It seemed we were a church that could talk about anything until homosexuality. Whoops, same-sex relationships. No, that's not right either. Gays and lesbians. No, it's LGBT. Nope, you've got to add a Q and now an A and other letters. This is where it began. We couldn't even get our nomenclature correct. Pretty soon we were in a shouting match. Our thoughtful, probing conversation had been replaced. Something had to change, but we weren't sure what. We had a long-standing don't ask, don't tell policy in our church. We also had a mission statement that prized diversity and authenticity. I thought to myself and to my elder board, wouldn't everyone see this incongruity? Wouldn't they understand the need for dialogue? Wouldn't it be obvious? How could we live authentically when anyone felt compelled to keep silent about their identities? I knew we had to take the plunge. So in 2009, holding our breath and not knowing where we were going to land, we started talking. We weren't actually after anything. We just started talking, knowing that our current state was untenable. Here's the thing. Talking took us to the bedrock of what we believed about God in the Bible. It forced us to grapple with power and privilege and the structures that maintain both. And if we were honest, it forced us to examine the sexual dynamics of our own lives, and it was exhausting. We used the World Cafe model to get the conversation started. With the congregation, we met with roundtable groups of 10. Our church moderator was present at every conversation. Ground rules were established. No proof texting, no name calling, no talking about others. Use I statements. Suspend your assumptions. More than 3/4 of our congregation decided to do just that. In the midst of all of our opinions, we were split right down the middle, maybe like some of your churches too. After the official roundtable conversations, we followed up with a planned approach to discuss Scripture, to discuss context then and now, to discuss real life. We did this through story sharing, through dinner groups. We offered book discussions, studies on Sunday mornings, Tuesday nights, Saturday afternoons. Whenever you wanted to talk about sex, my office door was wide open. At first, we wanted to find a common ground. It was that classic can't we all get along plea. We wanted to be together, all of us, conservatives, liberals. We wanted to make a stand without alienating anyone that we loved. We were all a family. And wasn't there a place for wacky old Uncle Joe and the prim, uptight cousin? Didn't we all call this place home? Within 6 months, our elder board had drafted a resolution statement. It seemed, after all the Sturm und Drang, to be almost anticlimactic. But we knew it was enough to set a course, a direction, and it did. And that's when things really hit the fan. People began to leave, and leave, and leave. Never a particularly big church. I estimate that we dropped by about 1/4. Some left out of conscience or hurt. Others left because saying anything that endorsed gays and lesbians in church leadership meant that they had to personally endorse it too. Every one of these losses were felt acutely. Some quietly drifted away, but most left feeling betrayed and like jilted lovers. This isn't the church I knew. You weren't the pastor I thought. And that's when I realized God was teaching me. First lesson I learned: God is always on the side of the oppressed. And I don't get to choose which oppressed. God is always on the side of those who are marginalized. Second thing I learned: the importance of humility, always. Whoever God is beyond us. We are grappling and we are groping. There's so much I don't know. I don't even know what I don't know. I don't know how to talk about what I don't know. And I know this, you don't either. You don't know what you don't know. The last thing was that no change is sustained by anger. That it's only love that produces long-lasting, abiding transformation. The world doesn't need more pissed-off activists. The world needs lovers. It needs lovers. Sometimes I'm asked to go to different churches, and I'm asked the question, would I do it again? That's what a lot of pastors want to know. There was fallout. The word heresy had been called out now and again. There's a well-known Bible institute right down the street from us. Our property is contiguous. They actively ask students not to worship with us. My pastor's group kind of fell apart. We came through. And like Jacob, who triumphed in that midnight wrestling session with the angel, he left to walk forever with a limp. And we do too. We've learned to walk with that limp. And we wouldn't have it any other way. Yeah. So I'm hoping that that's not a story of failure. I'm hoping that you can hear in that little quick 8-minute intro something of promise and something of hope. Because those who left our church throughout this time have maintained, by and large, amazing relationships. It took time, it took forgiveness, it took a lot of swallowing hard, it took almost radical engagement, but it's continued to flourish. Friendships have continued to flourish. Today, I want to really encourage us that we can have hard conversations, and we can have hard conversations about things that really matter, things that are close to people, things that are close to their heart. Stanley Hauerwas said, good communities are spaces where people love one another enough that they're not afraid of disagreements. In our pluralistic world, in our church, that we've seen all those wonderful statistics about kind of who's on the borderline, many of them are sitting in our church. Those who really don't know how to pray, or those who really don't know what they believe, they're in our pews. They would relish a hard conversation, a difficult conversation. It would push their faith at some level. It would push and spur growth at some level, if we know how to have it. If we know how to create the kind of space that would allow that kind of creative tension to be birthed and to come forth. When I first arrived at LaSalle Street Church, maybe 15 years ago now, it was during the season of Lent. And a professor from Trinity Christian College was giving his testimony. And he stood up front and he started to talk about how problematic he found the physical resurrection of Jesus. Now, I don't know how your churches talk about that, but I grew up as a Southern Baptist, and I am really dyed-in-the-wool Southern evangelical. So I started to sweat as this guy was talking. I mean, I started to look around, and I wondered, is anyone else as uncomfortable with this as I am? The more Dr. Baker talked, the more I heard my own doubts, the doubts that I had had in the middle of the night, the more I heard them brought now to light. But it was in the light of the sanctuary building, amongst all these people. And I could feel all these little things, these little doubts that I'd been carrying around. I felt them somehow honored in that moment. John Baker didn't stay in a place of disbelief. He didn't stay in a place of doubt. His testimony worked itself out to a place of orthodoxy that kind of settled everyone down. But the lesson was really clear for me, that this was a place where everything could be discussed. That was an important lesson for me, an important lesson in what it means to be a good community. Last month, I was down at Duke talking about the kind of communities that we have, that we represented in that room. I want you to think a little bit about your own community that you represent. And think about the kind of things that are off limits, the kind of things that are often not said aloud. And then enter into this exercise with me for a moment. The quality of the community that Jesus had around him. Confused. The disciples were often confused and often articulating that. They were diverse. They were forgiving communities. How is it that we know it as a forgiving community if there wasn't lots of stuff to be forgiven, right? They were angry communities sometimes, and they could express their frustration. They were unexpected, they were holy, they were questioning communities. What is this but creative tension? What is this but the kind of community that can make your palms sweat sometimes, right? These are not the things where you go in Sunday after Sunday and have the same expected stuff happens. The community that Jesus built around him was one of robust dialogue. These things that I just threw up here were fast. I'm sure if you were to get together with your leadership team and come up with another 15 descriptors, you could have a whole arm's length of the kind of description that Jesus encouraged around him. Well, what's happened to us? What's happened to us that these things are the very things we're trying to avoid? Arguments, really, in the church? Wow, I already have enough of them, right? Disagreements? People who are really going to get hot under the collar about some things? I feel like most of my time I'm trying to do away with that. What would make them what would make them to be encouraged in your church? What would be the payoff if you started to have hard conversations? Well, let me suggest a couple of things. Your capacity for honesty would grow. Your capacity for talking about things that matter in ways that hurt the least might grow. Paul, when he starts talking in another church community that had plenty of disagreements, right? This is a little a verse that I think oftentimes we overlook. This is just before the institution of the Lord's Supper. Some of you remember this, right? In 1 Corinthians 11. But to begin with, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. To some extent, I believe it. Indeed, there have to be factions. There have to be factions. For only so will it become clear who among you is genuine. See, there's some value in having disagreements. There's lots of sociological work on this, and I'm going to get to a couple of them in a minute here. I know that when I am pushed to articulate things, and when I'm called to lean in and hear you articulate your thing, something holy happens in that moment, right? Something that's like sacred listening starts to happen in that moment. Difficult conversations were expected around Jesus, and they seem to be expected in the apostolic church. If we had time, we would romp through those early years of theology making in the church. Theology making didn't normally come down to a vote. Theology making happened because people were in robust disagreement, and they put it out there on the table, and they prayerfully hammered it out in conversation. If you wanted to be the kind of church, the kind of community that might start these kind of conversations, how would you go about doing it? I want to use my last 10 minutes to just run through a few things. There was a wonderful book by Jonathan Haidt that came out maybe 2 years ago, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Did anybody read that book? Yeah, it was terrific, wasn't it? Christina Cleveland has another book that's a little bit similar to that and more religiously oriented. But Jonathan Haidt's big thing, his big learning that came out of that book, is that when we're in conversation with people, our intuitions come first and our strategic reasoning second. What he means is that when we're presented with an ethical challenge or with a problem in front of us, gay marriage, abortion rights, fracking in Minnesota or in North Dakota, when we're presented with those kind of ethical dilemmas, we have an intuition. We have a hunch about our opinion on that. Jonathan Haidt found out again and again that that's where we start from. And everything else, we just figure out how to line it up to prove our intuition. Our intuition comes first. Then we line up the things that can prove it. It's why we don't get persuaded by more facts. Have you heard that recent thing out there? More facts don't cause you to change your mind politically. They don't do it. We like to deny that, but Jonathan Haidt and others found they don't do it. What changes us is an emotional response. What changes us is a story that draws us in and causes us to see something from a different slant, from a different angle. He'll say in that book again that he uses this Indian metaphor, and he says that the mind is divided like a rider on an elephant. The rider's job is to serve the elephant. The mind is the rider, and our intuitions are the elephant. Our moral reasoning becomes our efforts at articulating the rightness of our judgment that was based on our instinct. So, if that's the case, it's not about giving more information to people to have a good conversation. It's about moving into the area of their instincts. How do we start conversations around where our instincts are? A couple of ways. This comes actually from several sources, Dale Carnegie among them. Remember the old How to Win Friends and Influence People's book? But Jonathan Haidt also covers this as well. Showing empathy. If you wanted to build the kind of church communities, faith communities that can have conversations around abortion, gun control, whatever, the first thing is to show empathy. To realize that everyone has a viewpoint, a position, a place from which they are using their intuition that's good and holy. Second, to self-analyze. This was Jesus' brilliance again and again, right? You have to own your own stuff. You got to own your own stuff. As a leader, we have to own our own stuff. What I learned in our sexuality conversation and what was played out again and again, that some of the most vociferous voices on the table, Those people who would be the first to stand up and speak and have a very strong and strident view that they're speaking about, either, on either side, they tended to be the people who I knew had been hurt in this area. They tended to be people who had built up a lot of steam and a lot of energy around this, right? Conversations open a place for that steam to be released. Hopefully. And we saw this in some cases. Hopefully, not only is the steam released, but also healing becomes an important element there. To self-analyze, to understand your own stuff. If you don't understand your own stuff, then I'd suggest it's going to be really hard to create these spaces, these empathetic, listening, sacred spaces. Showing empathy, self-analyzing, and then modeling humility. Modeling humility. Model, lead, create a culture of what I said at the front end. I don't know what I don't know. Can you imagine how liberating that is for people to hear that? How it opens up a space for them to say, wow, you know what? I'm so relieved. I don't know either. I don't know either. It opens up a space then for conversation to happen without preconceived agendas weighing it down. I don't know what I don't know. But of course, even with these kind of values, even starting out with these kind of values, it's really easy for conversation to start descending, right? Maybe some of us have even done this in our church. We've started out with these values. We've started out with these great intentions to talk about this really hot topic. And maybe we have these tools in our tool chest, and it still went south. A couple other good models. One is this rabbinical framework. And we use this at different points in time for different conversations that we had too. This actually comes from Brad Hirschfield's book, which is called You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right. Great title, isn't it? You don't have to be wrong for me to be right. Brad Hirschfield is a rabbi who has had just an eclectic faith journey. He started out as an Orthodox Jew. He was from the North Shore of Chicago. He then goes and lives in a kibbutz in Israel for a number of years. While he's there, he becomes a strident Zionist. He has a transformation experience over there, comes back, leaves faith altogether before now moving into a reformed rabbinical framework. This is a framework that he uses for a lot of his own conversations. The rabbis recognized that conflict was a healthy part of human relationships. And so, of course, there's 7 steps, right? Of course, they would come up with 7. First, admit that sometimes you need a break. So as you start these hard conversations, admit that sometimes people need to back off from them a little bit. You respect the basic dignity of even the worst person in the midst. You know, Riverside Church, they had this, for a while there, Riverside Church in New York, they were going through a time of conversation where one year they would be a fully welcoming, inclusive community. The congregation would vote. That's the way the vote would go. The next year it might swing back the other way. And this is the way they were through the 80s and early 90s, kind of moving back and forth on this flashpoint issue. Well, one of the leaders said, this is what we did. After the vote was taken, and say, this year we're the inclusive and welcoming community. He said, the very next thing we said, we have a marginalized group in our church. So our efforts at love need to be on the marginalized, need to be on those who lost the vote. Isn't that kind of a radical brain shift for us? That we would be so intentional to those who are marginalized in our communities, that we would be outdoing ourselves in love to them, respect the basic dignity of even the worst person in our midst. Radical empathy. Radical empathy. If we had time, we would kind of talk through this scenario that Brad Hirschfield gives. Determine how each person remains our teacher. You know, that's part, I think, of leadership in the 21st century that we really struggle with. Some ideas just seem stupid. You know, some ideas are just stupid. And some ideas you think, well, they're founded in such great ignorance, how can you possibly hold to that position? You see the kind of weight that it puts on a leader to stick close enough to the people in the pews and close enough to God that you recognize that every person out there has something to teach us and that we're radically connected to them? Acknowledge the consequences. We had to acknowledge that in our church when people started to leave. We had to acknowledge that we were on a path. And we had to acknowledge the hurt that went on both sides and the loss that went on both sides. We also had to acknowledge that personal accountability piece. That you can say things correctly. You can say things that are the truth, but not say them well, right? You can say the truth and you can do it in such a bastardly way that perhaps the truth shouldn't have been said in the first place, right? So we had to keep bringing that, and we had to keep bringing our own hearts before each other and before God. Personal accountability. Even when you're right, you can be wrong. You can be wrong. And then this other piece, that relationships always matter more than ideas. And that's hard for evangelicals, because we live and die, right, on a few ideas out there, a few truths that are golden. So we had to really keep recalibrating. What does it mean to be in relationship with other people? Another model, and I'll be fast here, congregational dialogue framework. One of the things that we learned as well, again, we use different frameworks for different conversations, and I offer these as tools. I mean, this is not didactic. It's really tools to be used as you see fit. This comes from the book, The Virtue of Dialogue by Christopher Smith. It's a story of Inglewood Church in Indianapolis. They began with a series of Sunday evening Bible studies. It was a church in decline that was facing a lot of external pressures around them. They learned that the conversations always had to be Eucharistic. And I think that hits some of that other framework too, those 7 rabbinical framework. It has to be directly related to our practice of sacrament, to our practice of entering into self-denial, entering into Jesus' death and his life. Conversations should be open. And as far as possible, we had as many conversations as possible with as many people as possible. There didn't need to be a group that somehow was over here really doing the busy work, the real crux of it, and all of us were having these play conversations, these phony conversations. They had to be substantive across the board. We learned that silence is just as important as speaking. And we learned that conversation is slow church. It's slow church. It takes a while. You want a quick decision, you vote on it. You want a decision that's emerging by conversation, it's going to take a bit. It's going to take some time. And I think it's worth it. The last one, and this is where I'll end, because I've got handouts for this on the way out. And it's the way that we did our conversations around sexuality. In fact, let me just ask, how many people are having that conversation in your church? Oh, not very many. Oh, half? Okay, all right, maybe those were like smaller hands, okay. I just want to affirm, you can do it. And you can do it with a lot of people still standing with you at the end. You can do it and move to a place of such healthy authenticity, such healthy honesty, if you just choose to make some decisions along the way. I feel like I learned the hard way. I learned just trial by fire. And it was after the fact that I learned all these great resources that were out there that could have been good guideposts. What we learned, and we had some ground rules. We used some of the models that I've talked about here already. And we have a whole 2 pages of models that you can pick up on your way out. We had people suspend their assumptions. We had people regard one another as colleagues. We had a facilitator who held the context of dialogue. That conversation started in 2009. It actually really finished up in 2011. That was 2 years of dialogue. And it's only been really in the last year and a half, I would say, that we've really been able to kind of live into the fullness of what that meant. Some people who left have come back. Some people who have stayed a little uneasily have found a new place of freedom in our church. We have had new folks come in. All those things have happened, yes, yes, and yes. But the deeper thing that's happened to us is that we are honest people before God and before each other. We speak about things with a greater degree of respect. We have tools in the toolbox to have other hard conversations, and we are engaged in other hard conversations now. We're engaged in the conversation of how we're going to respond to violence in the city of Chicago. That's a huge thing for us. We're having a conversation about how we can continue to be a socially justice-oriented church in a neighborhood that's rapidly gentrifying. Those conversations would have been very divisive in a different era for us. Altogether, we've learned the truth of community, and we've learned that God speaks through others, and we've learned how to hold truth loosely before God and before each other in that holy space of creative tension. So, all the best to all the rest of us as we continue in these conversations. Thank you.